Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hard Count podcast, and today we're going to be going over my must-draft running backs for Fantasy Football 2020. Real quick, before we get into it, I'd just like to remind you guys to hit that like button, subscribe, really helps out. Of course, I'd never want you to miss out on this regular content here at the Hard Count. But without further ado, let's get right into the video. My first guy is Austin Ekeler of the Los Angeles Chargers. Must-draft guy for me. First guy we're going to be talking about today. Currently going off the board is the RB14 in standard leagues and the RB12 in PPR leagues. Ekeler, for me, could be a league-winning guy this year. Sky's the limit for Austin Ekeler. Main concern that I hear from people with Austin Ekeler is Justin Jackson's there in Los Angeles. He's going to be taking carries away from Ekeler, which is the case, but that's not enough for me to shy away from a guy that has this much upside. A guy that was a stud last year in fantasy, even when splitting carries with Justin Jackson and Melvin Gordon. For me, main story with Austin Ekeler, Melvin Gordon is gone this year. He's the number one back in LA, and I totally think he can handle that role. If we take a look at it, last year, in those games, Melvin Gordon was out, which was the first 4 weeks, where he held out. Austin Ekeler rushed the ball 15 times per game and had 6.5 receptions per game. That is 21.5 opportunities per game without Melvin Gordon. That is in the same range as the guys like Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, all those guys that are going in the top 5 to 6 running backs on the board. They're the guys that you're taking at the top of the first round. The only person that really consistently outperformed 21 opportunities was Christian McCaffrey, who had a historically amazing fantasy season last year. So Austin Ekeler, who is arguably the single most efficient running back in the NFL, and as last year he was first in efficiency in terms of production premium and yards per touch with 7 yards per touch, which is ridiculous, is getting the same amount of touches as Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, those guys that you're taking at the top of the first round and are most sure that are going to succeed. So that is huge to me because, and people are going to be like, oh, well, Justin Jackson wasn't there. Yes, he was. He was there. He was getting 7-8 carries a game. And that's quite a few, and I'm expecting that to be similar to what it is this year. I think he's going to be taking maybe 7-8 carries a game, but that's okay. If Austin Ekeler is getting 16, 17 carries a game, that's great. And, also I talked about this in my Do Not Draft Wide Receivers video when I talked about Keenan Allen. Tyrod Taylor is a quarterback that is historically shown in Buffalo and where he has always been that he really loves to target tight ends and running backs underneath. He's shown, a tendency to throw to running backs over wide receivers a lot of time. In Buffalo, LaShawn McCoy often finishes the number 2, number 3 receiving guy on that Buffalo team and was getting oftentimes just as many receptions as the wide receivers. So in this LA offense that last year loved to dump the ball off to Austin Ekeler, I think it's going to keep that up because Tyrod Taylor has always shown that he likes to dump it off to his running backs. So I expect that to stay up this year. Another thing that's very, very exciting to me about Austin Ekeler, and this is one of the main reasons that I'm on him so high this year and not too concerned about Justin Jackson, is last year Austin Ekeler had the 11th most touchdowns in the NFL among running backs. I expect that number to increase maybe significantly this year. Last season, Melvin Gordon had 13 touches inside the 5-yard line, 8th in the NFL. Those carries have to go somewhere, and I expect them to go to Austin Ekeler. What about Justin Jackson? Why isn't he going to get the carries? Well, they're the same size. No real reason to give it to Justin Jackson over Austin Ekeler. And Ekeler last year had 7 carries inside the 5. As I said, Melvin Gordon had 13, Ekeler had 7, and Ekeler also had 11 carries inside the 10, which was very good. It's not amazing or anything, but pretty solid. Top 25 in the league, top 20 in the league in terms of goal line carries inside the 10 carries. But Justin Jackson, on the other hand, had 1 carry inside the 10 and 0 carries inside the 5 last year. LA did not trust Justin Jackson at all last year in the red zone. They trusted Austin Ekeler to an extent, so I'm much more confident in them giving those carries that Melvin Gordon has left vacant inside the 5-yard line, inside the 10-yard line, to Austin Ekeler than Justin Jackson, because I have no real reason to believe that they're going to give him to Justin Jackson because they didn't even do it last year. So Similar to what I talked about with Devin Singletary in my Do Not Draft Running Backs video. I have no reason to believe that they're going to give the ball to him in the red zone because they haven't historically. So I think that's going to be the case. Austin Ekeler is going to get a lot of those touches inside the 5, inside the 10 that Melvin Gordon was getting last year and isn't there to take this year. So those can translate into quite a bit of touchdowns for Austin Ekeler. So yes, I know that I don't think they're going to get all 13. I think that the amount of times they're going to be inside the 5, inside the 10 is going to go down because I don't expect the offense to be quite as good with Taylor as it was with Phillip Rivers. I still expect an offense that's going to get to the red zone, and when it does, I expect them to give the ball to Austin Ekeler much more than they do to Justin Jackson. But for me, those are my reasons. Again, we got a guy that is going to be getting many, many touches, maybe just as much as the guys you're taking at the top of the first round. He's also one of the most efficient running backs in the league. And those vacant red zone carries that Melvin Gordon's had last year, they've got to go somewhere. I expect him to go to Austin Ekeler. So yeah, for me, Austin Ekeler is a must draft in the second round at his current ADP and has the potential in my eyes to finish as a top 4 or 5 running back easily on this year. So yeah, that's why I've got Austin Ekeler on this list. Next, we have Miles Sanders, who's a must draft for me, currently going off the board at the 202 in 12-team leagues, 204 in 10-team leagues. And the Eagles still have not brought in another running back, and I think many of us thought that they'd bring in a veteran guy. Miles Sanders' fantasy draft stock would probably plummet a little bit because they're going to be giving those third down carries, red zone carries, that some of them are going to be taken away from Miles Sanders, but they still have not signed one. And because of that, for me, Miles Sanders as a second-round pick is a huge steal for me. This guy, I think Miles Sanders has some league-winning upside, and we look at it last year, Miles Sanders played on 53.7% of the Eagles snaps, which was 27th in the NFL in terms of snap share. And even with this 27th highest snap share, he still ended up with 63 targets on the year, which was 13th among running backs, which just shows that the rate that he was getting targeted was very, very high, very ridiculous, and that Eagles offense, and I expect that to continue. He's going to be getting targeted a lot. So when you bump that snap share up, those targets are definitely going to go way up as well. And in my opinion, the snap rate will go up this year. Last 5 weeks of the season, we saw there were 4 games in which Miles Sanders had an 80% or higher snap share, which is huge. That's top 10, top 5 in the league in terms of snap share, which boosts Miles Sanders' ability to put up numbers hugely. And I expect that, I don't know if I expect 80%, but I expect definitely higher than 53%, which it was last year. And I'm expecting more targets going to Miles Sanders this year because of that higher snap share as well. And just like we were talking with Austin Ekeler and Melvin Gordon, Miles Sanders is going to be getting a lot of those goal line carries that Jordan Howard left on the board last season. Jordan Howard and Sanders got similar goal line carries. They both got around 8 throughout the year. So yes, I do think a lot of those Jordan Howard carries are going to go to Miles Sanders, and maybe he's going to turn a couple of those 3, 4 into touchdowns, maybe 1 or 2 into receiving touchdowns, 1, 2, 3. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we could be expecting a doubling on his touchdown opportunities and doubling on the touchdown numbers as well. So to me, Miles Sanders is the makeup, what you are looking for to find a league-winning running back, and he's drafted in the second round. Pass-catching guy, usually averaging less than 19 carries a game, which Sanders is doing. Fits that role perfectly. I expect somewhere in the 15 to 20 carries a game range. Pass-catching back, which is the definition of over recent years. That's what league-winning running backs have been. And Miles Sanders fits that perfectly. Doesn't have somebody that's really competing in that backfield. I do not see Boston Scott taking many reps away from Miles Sanders at all. So for me, I don't see where you can go wrong with Miles Sanders as a second-round pick. He can be RB2, and I don't see that. I see that almost as his floor for this year. He's got huge upside to become a league winner this year. Please pick up Miles Sanders in your drafts. He will definitely return the favor, put up some very solid fantasy production for you. So yeah, that's why I've got Miles Sanders here on this list. But let's move on to my next guy. That is Chris Carson. To me, he's a must-draft running back in the 4th round. Big time value here for me. Yes, there is injury concern, and that is why people are very hesitant on taking him. But to me, that 4th round value, 100% worth that risk of him getting injured. The upside with Chris Carson is real. He's an absolute workhorse with the Seahawks. Thanks to Nick Ercolano for this stat, is counting week 16, where Carson left because he got injured. Carson had 16 plus touches in 93% of his games, 18 plus in 86% of his games, 20 plus touches in 64% of his games, and 24 plus touches in half of his games. Those numbers are ridiculous. You don't get many running backs in the league with similar numbers like that. And to me, there's absolutely no reason to see those numbers decreasing this year either. They didn't really add anyone. Yes, they added a 4th round rookie, and Rashad Penny is still there, but I don't think either of them are going to be taking too many carries away from Chris Carson. And for me, I'm putting this in the point of view of me drafting. My draft strategy this year definitely is going to be running back heavy out of the gate, because this year, very top heavy on the running backs overall. And so to me, if I put it in perspective, this point in the draft being the 4th round where you'd probably be grabbing Chris Carson, I've got 2 running backs that I took in the 1st, 2nd rounds that I trust to put up good fantasy production. Guys like Ekeler, guys like Miles Sanders, whoever you took in the 1st round, they're guys that you're confident in producing, don't have too much risk involved with them. I take that wide receiver 1 in the 3rd round. I'm confident with his production and what I can get out of him. I'm confident in the wide receiver options in rounds 5, 6, and 7 because of how deep this wide receiver pool is in the middle rounds. And that talent really stretches down. And the upside, you can get guys that could potentially finish as wide receiver 1s all the way down in round 7. So I love the wide receivers in the middle, late rounds this year. Not so much the running backs. You're in round 4. Chris Carson, to me, absolutely worth the risk. He's got RB1 upside on any given week. In standard leagues last year, he had 15 plus points in more than half the games he played in. So he's currently being drafted around guys as well that I do not see getting nearly as much production as Carson, who's the clear-cut number 1 option, and it's not close on one of the most run-heavy offenses in the NFL. So, again, get in that round 4, you get a guy that's has RB1 upside, in my opinion, in the 4th round that you can play in the flex. And yes, he has the potential to get injured, but to me, the upside completely outweighs the downside with Chris Carson. Yes, he has some risk, but to me, that reward in the 4th round far outweighs the risk for Chris Carson. So I don't have too much to say there, but that's what I have to say about Chris Carson. Next, we've got Ronald Jones. Ronald Jones is a must-draft running back to come off your bench, RB3, RB4 in 2020, going as the RB30 in rounds 7 to 8. One of my favorite things to go by when I'm drafting fantasy players is good offense, usually means good fantasy production, means more goal line carries, it means more opportunities, it means just overall better fantasy numbers. And Ronald Jones and the Buccaneers definitely have a good offense in 2020 with the additions of Tom Brady and Gronk and guys like that. And you also have got the dynamic receiving duo as well. So it's a good offense. That means more red zone touches, more goal line carries. Again, good thing for Ronald Jones. And people are getting very hyped about Keyshawn Vaughn. I do not see that happening. Bruce Arians himself has said that Ronald Jones is definitively the number 1 guy, and I honestly think that Ronald Jones is the most talented guy. He's going to be the guy that for sure comes out of the backfield and proves to be the number 1 guy, and I think he is going to be given that number 1 role, and he's going to keep it from week 1. So I think very good sign for me. I expect many more carries from Ronald Jones this year. Last year, Peyton Barber was the number 1 guy for most of the year, and he's gone away from the Buccaneers this year. And so now, Ronald Jones put in that position. He is the number 1 guy. He's finally able to show us what he can do as that number 1 guy. But definitely going to get more production than last year, because last year he only had 30% snap share, which is terrible, very bad. Reason he wasn't very effective fantasy-wise. But Jones going to get a lot more touches this year. He's, again, as the number 1 running back on that offense, which is 14th in rushing plays per game last year. And I expect them to run the ball even more this year because they're a team that likes to balance the pass and the run. And they're not going to be trailing as much as they were last year, nearly as much with Tom Brady. And company as they were with Jameis Winston and company. I mentioned this stat in my Do Not Draft Receivers video, but on 535 of their offensive plays last year, they were trailing, and they ran the ball on 30% of those plays. But on the 401 plays that they were leading, they ran the ball 48% of the time. So that is a lot of carries that are going to go to Ronald Jones and going to be spread around that backfield because they're going to be winning a lot more this year. They're going to be running the ball a lot more to preserve that lead. And last year, Ronald Jones struggled and finished a little bit. He was not the favored back in the red zone because Peyton Barber was, and he ended the season with 8 goal line carries. And I think at least 5 of 6 of those will go to Jones, not to mention the fact that the Brady and the Buccaneers are going to be inside the 5-yard line a lot more frequently than they were last season. And an improved offensive line, which always helps running backs. We've seen it with Gurley. Gurley had one of the best fantasy seasons of all time. The offensive line fell apart, and it just didn't happen. So the offensive line is a very underrated part of a fantasy running back's game, and the Buccaneers definitely improved their O-line this year, so that definitely helps Ronald Jones out. So to me, Ronald Jones, very underrated pickup, RB3, RB4, that you can pick up in round 8 and consistently take in and out of your starting lineup all year, and has a lot of upside. He's going to be early down back, get a lot of goal line carries, receiving reps as well, which I don't think people give him some credit for. We saw some flashes of success in that area last season. Please draft Ronald Jones in the 8th rounds of your fantasy drafts. You'll be very happy with your selection. He's one of the last guys that I'd feel confident starting on a week-to-week basis on the board. So definitely consider picking him up. And yeah, he was my last guy. So thanks so much for listening. Those were the guys that I consider must-draft running backs in fantasy football this year. Thanks so much for listening. Again, peace.